The orchard had been dead for 6 years. Not dying. Dead. The apple trees along the north fence row had gone gray and brittle, their bark peeling in long strips the way bark peels when the water has stopped moving inside. The pear trees in the center section were standing but hollow. You could press your thumb into the wood at the base and feel it give, soft as wet cardboard. The cherry trees along the south edge had simply fallen, one by one, each one leaning toward the ground until the roots gave up holding. 3 acres of what had once been the best-producing orchard in Harlan County, Kentucky. Now it was 3 acres of standing deadwood and weeds, and the particular silence of land that has been abandoned long enough to forget what it was supposed to do. The county extension office had looked at it in 1987. Their report used the word unsalvageable twice. Dale Whitfield, the agent who wrote the report, had been careful with his language because he was a careful man, but the conclusion was not gentle. The soil pH was critically low. The drainage had failed. Water was pooling at the roots during wet seasons and baking the clay during dry ones. The remaining trees that were technically still alive were operating at less than 15% of normal productivity and showing root stress that suggested they had perhaps 2 seasons left before they followed the others. The property had been on the market for 3 years. The asking price had started at $4,000 and dropped steadily, like a stone finding the bottom of a well. By the spring of 1989, it was listed at $300. Cash. As is. No representations about the soil or the trees or the drainage or anything else. The real estate agent, a woman named Carol Perkins who had been selling rural property in Harlan County for 16 years, had shown it to 11 people. Every one of them had walked the property, looked at the dead trees, looked at the soil, and walked back to their cars without making an offer. 3 of them had laughed. Not at Carol. At the property itself. The particular laughter of people encountering something they find absurd, a joke that the land was telling at someone else's expense. The 12th person who looked at it was Walter Cobb. He was 41 years old. He had farmed 110 acres outside Harlan for 17 years, a mixed operation, some corn, some tobacco, a kitchen garden that his wife Margaret had expanded over the years into something considerably more serious than a kitchen garden. He had no particular background in orchards. What he had was something more specific and harder to name. He had been watching that 3 acres for 4 years. Not constantly. Not obsessively. But with the consistent attention of a man who has noticed something that other people have decided not to notice and who has not yet made up his mind about what it means. He had driven past the orchard property on Route 14 approximately twice a week for 4 years. He had stopped twice, once in the fall of 1987 and once in the spring of 1988, and walked the property without permission, which in rural Kentucky was not considered trespass so much as reasonable curiosity. He had looked at the dead trees. He had looked at the soil. He had looked at the drainage patterns. He had crouched at the base of 3 different trees and pressed the soil between his fingers and smelled it. He had noticed something that the Extension Office report had not mentioned. Not because the Extension Office was careless. Because the thing Walter noticed was not the kind of thing that appears in a soil report. On his second visit, the spring of 1988, he had found the remnant of an old root system at the base of one of the fallen cherry trees. The tree itself was gone, but the root had been exposed by erosion, and in the exposed root he had seen something. New growth. A single shoot, perhaps 8 inches long, coming from the base of a root that by any reasonable assessment should have been as dead as everything else on the property. He had crouched beside that shoot for a long time. He had not touched it. He had stood up and walked the rest of the property again, this time looking not at what was dead, but at what was alive, however small, however marginal, however easy to miss if you were looking for the wrong thing. He found 7 more. 7 places on the 3 acres where something was still trying. He drove home. He said nothing to Margaret that evening. He said nothing the following day. He thought about it for 3 weeks. Then he called Carol Perkins. "The orchard on Route 14, he said. Is it still available?" Carol said it was. $300, Walter said. 300, Carol confirmed. She said it the way people say things they are slightly embarrassed by, quickly, to get past it. "I'll take it," Walter said. He drove to Carol's office the following morning with $300 in cash in an envelope. Carol processed the paperwork with professional efficiency and only once, very briefly, allowed her expression to suggest that she was not entirely certain she was doing Walter a favor. He signed. He drove to the orchard. He stood in the middle of the 3 acres. He looked at the dead trees. He looked at the 7 places where something was still trying. He did not feel the thing that people expect a man to feel when he has just made a purchase that everyone around him considers foolish. He felt the thing that comes before work. Clarity. He knew what this was going to take. He had known for 3 weeks. He was ready to begin. What he did not know yet, what would only become clear over the following months, was that the laugh he was about to walk into was larger than he had imagined. But that story was waiting for him at the feed store on a Tuesday morning. The laughter arrived before the work did. Walter had not announced the purchase. He had not told anyone except Margaret, who had listened to his explanation with the focused attention she always brought to things Walter said carefully, and had then asked 2 questions, practical ones, about drainage and soil amendment costs, and had said, "If you think it's there, it's probably there." That was Margaret. But rural Kentucky in 1989 was not Margaret. Word moved through Harlan County the way it always moved, through the feed store, the co-op, the grain elevator, the diner on Route 56 where farmers ate breakfast before the day began. By the Thursday after he signed the papers, 3 people had stopped Walter at the feed store to ask if it was true. He said it was. The first man, a farmer named Dennis Prater who ran 200 acres of tobacco and considered himself a practical man, looked at Walter with the expression of someone who has just been told something they cannot quite process. "Walter," Dennis said, "that orchard's been dead since '83. The county said it was unsalvageable." "I know what the county said," Walter said. "You paid $300 for it." "I did." Dennis shook his head slowly. Not unkindly, but with the particular headshake of a man who has filed something in the category of things he will understand better with time. The second man laughed outright. The third, an older farmer named Bill Combs who had been around long enough to have watched the orchard when it was producing, said simply, $300. That's about what it's worth for firewood. Walter bought his feed and drove home. Over the following 2 weeks, the story collected the embellishments that all such stories collect in small communities. By the time it reached the far end of the county, Walter had paid $300 for a field full of dead sticks, and was planning to grow apples in a graveyard. The version that circulated at the diner added the detail that the extension office had told him personally it was hopeless, which was not quite accurate but was close enough to the truth that nobody corrected it. The consensus was consistent across every telling. Walter Cobb had wasted $300. At 41 years old with a farm to run and a family to support, he had bought something that every qualified person who had looked at it had declared worthless. He would figure that out by the end of the first season. The first season, it turned out, was more complicated than anyone, including Walter, had anticipated. Not because he was wrong about the orchard. Because he was right in a way that was going to require considerably more patience than $300 worth of dead trees suggested. He started in April of 1989 with the drainage. That was the first thing. The most fundamental thing. Before soil amendment, before any work on the trees, before anything else. Because the drainage was why the orchard had died. He had worked this out during his 3 weeks of thinking after the second visit to the property. The extension report had noted the drainage failure as a consequence of the orchard's decline, the trees dying, the root systems failing, the soil structure collapsing. What the report had not considered was whether the drainage failure was also a cause. Whether the trees had died because the drainage had failed first, and the failed drainage had created the soil conditions that had killed them. Walter thought it was the cause. He thought it had happened in stages. Sometime in the late 1970s, possibly related to the grading work on Route 14 that had changed the runoff patterns across several properties, the natural drainage that had served the orchard for decades had been disrupted. Water that had previously moved through and away from the orchard's root zone had begun pooling. The pooling had created anaerobic conditions at the root level. The anaerobic conditions had damaged the roots. The root damage had stressed the trees. The stressed trees had become susceptible to disease. The disease had finished them. It had taken approximately 4 years from the first drainage disruption to the point where the county extension office looked at the property and wrote the word unsalvageable. If he was right, fixing the drainage was not supplementary to restoring the orchard. It was the restoration. Everything else, soil amendment, Tree work, whatever came after, would be temporary and inadequate if the drainage remained wrong. He spent April and May digging. By hand, mostly. A drainage system designed to correct the Route 14 runoff problem and restore the original flow pattern through the orchard's root zone. It was not a small project. It was, in fact, one of the more physically demanding things Walter Cobb had done in 17 years of farming. He worked before sunrise and after sunset on the days when his own farm required his daytime hours. He worked full days on the days when it didn't. Margaret brought food to the orchard property on 3 occasions and found him in a ditch. She did not ask him to stop. She was that kind of woman. By June, the drainage system was functional. By July, the water table in the orchard's root zone had visibly changed. The pooling that had been present in the spring, visible in the way certain areas of the property stayed saturated long after rainfall, was gone. The soil was draining. It had not been draining properly for approximately 10 years. Now it was. Walter stood in the orchard in July of 1989 and looked at soil that was beginning, very slowly and very tentatively, to remember what it was supposed to do. He thought about the 7 shoots he had found the previous spring. He went to check on them. 6 of the 7 were still alive. 1 had grown to 14 inches. He crouched beside it for a long time. Then he went back to work. The soil amendment took 2 years. Not because Walter was slow. Because soil is not fast. He had the property tested in August of 1989, a full analysis, sent to the University Extension Laboratory in Lexington. The results confirmed what he had suspected from his own observations. The pH was critically low, 4.8 in the worst sections, barely above the threshold at which apple and pear trees can survive at all. The organic matter content was depleted. The biological activity, the microbial life that makes soil soil rather than dirt, was minimal. The Extension Laboratory sent the results with a cover letter that recommended a series of lime applications over 3 years to correct the pH, a commercial fertilizer program to address the nutrient deficiencies, and the note that even with aggressive intervention, productive capacity would require 5 to 7 years to establish. Walter read the letter twice. He filed it. He did not follow its recommendations. Not because they were wrong. Because he had a different approach. He had been composting since 1981, not as an ideology, not as a philosophy, but as a practical response to the cost of commercial inputs on a farm his size. His compost operation on his home property was substantial. He had been doing it long enough and systematically enough that he had developed a reliable source of high-quality biological amendment. He had also, over the previous 2 years, developed a working relationship with 2 dairy operations in the next county who were looking for places to land their manure at minimal cost. He arranged to receive it. The soil amendment program Walter ran on the orchard property over the following 2 years was not the program the laboratory recommended. It was more aggressive in some ways and less aggressive in others. He applied lime, that much was the same, because the pH correction was non-negotiable. But he applied it in conjunction with heavy compost inputs rather than commercial fertilizer, and he seeded the orchard floor with a cover crop mix that he had worked out over 3 years of experimentation on his own farm, a combination of legumes and deep-rooted grasses designed to fix nitrogen and break up the compaction layer simultaneously. He did not plant any trees in 1989 or 1990. This was the part that most confused the people who were watching. Dennis Prater drove past the orchard in the fall of 1990 and saw Walter working the soil between the dead trees with a walk-behind tiller. He stopped. He leaned out the window. "Walter," he said, "what are you doing?" "Building the soil," Walter said. Dennis looked at the property. The dead trees were still standing. Walter had not removed them yet. The cover crop was visible between them, green and growing. The drainage channels Walter had dug were also visible, neat and functional looking. But there were no new trees. No sign that anything was going to produce fruit in any foreseeable time frame. "You've had this place 18 months, Dennis said. "Yes," Walter said. "You haven't planted anything." "I've planted cover crop," Walter said. "And I've been building the soil." Dennis looked at the orchard. He looked at Walter. He drove on. At the diner the following Tuesday, the story had a new chapter. Walter Cobb was mowing weeds and digging ditches on his $300 dead orchard and still hadn't planted a single tree. Bill Combs said, "He'll figure it out by spring." The spring of 1991 arrived. Walter still did not plant trees. He did something different. He began grafting. The 7 original shoots he had found in 1988, the 6 that were still alive by 1989, the one that had grown to 14 inches, had by 1991 become something worth paying attention to. They were not trees. They were not anywhere near trees. But they were alive, and they were alive on rootstock that had survived 10 years of wrong drainage and depleted soil and the death of everything around them. That rootstock had something. Walter did not know exactly what it had. He was not a botanist and did not use that language. What he knew, from 17 years of farming and from the particular observation he had brought to this property since 1987, was that a root that survives what those roots had survived has demonstrated something about its relationship with this specific ground that no nursery tree can demonstrate. He began grafting heritage variety scion wood onto those roots. The variety he chose was not from a catalog. It was from a tree. Specifically, it was from a tree on an abandoned property 6 miles east of Harlan, a single apple tree, perhaps 80 years old, still producing fruit of a quality that Walter had noticed when he had stopped to look at it on a drive home in the fall of 1990. He had asked the property owner, an elderly woman named Ruth Hensley, who no longer farmed but had not sold, if he could take scion wood from the tree. Ruth Hensley had looked at him for a moment. Then she had said, "My father planted that tree in 1912. He said it would outlast anything you could buy from a nursery." She paused. "Take what you need." Walter took scion wood. He grafted it onto the surviving rootstock. He did this carefully, methodically, over 3 weekends in the spring of 1991. He did not tell anyone what he was doing or why. At the feed store in April, someone asked him when he was going to plant trees on the orchard property. Walter said he already had. The man looked confused. Walter bought his feed and drove home. By the summer of 1993, something was visible. Not productive. Not impressive by any conventional measure. But visible. The grafted trees, 11 of them, attached to the surviving rootstock, had established themselves in the amended soil. They were small. 4 years after the grafting, they were still small in the way that trees grown on heritage rootstock in properly conditioned soil are small, consolidating, building structure, developing the root architecture that would eventually determine what they could produce. They were not producing fruit. They were not going to produce fruit for at least 2 more years. Walter knew this. He had known it in 1989 when he bought the property. The people watching from outside did not know it, or had not accepted it, and by 1993 the community consensus on Walter Cobb's orchard had evolved from amused skepticism to something closer to genuine concern. Dennis Prater stopped by the property in June of 1993. He found Walter pruning the young grafted trees with a precision that suggested he had done considerable research on the subject. "Walter," Dennis said, "it's been 4 years." "It has," Walter said. "You've got 11 little trees and a lot of cover crop." 12, Walter said. "One more took this spring." Dennis looked at the 12 small trees. He looked at the dead trees still standing at the perimeter of the property. Walter had left them deliberately, as wind breaks, until the new trees were established enough not to need them. "When are these going to produce?" Dennis said. 2 more years, Walter said. "Maybe 3. Dennis was quiet for a moment. 4 years in, he said. "And you're telling me 2 or 3 more?" "At minimum," Walter said. Dennis shook his head. He drove home. At the diner he told Bill Combs what Walter had said. Bill Combs said, "The man is farming patience instead of fruit." He meant it as a criticism. It was, in fact, the most accurate description of what Walter was doing that anyone in Harlan County had produced. The years between 1993 and 1996 were the years that tested whether Walter had correctly understood what he was doing or had simply been stubborn in a direction that happened to last longer than most people expected. The cover crop program continued. The soil tests, Walter ran them annually, tracking the pH correction and the organic matter recovery, showed consistent improvement. By 1994, the pH in the best sections had reached 6.2, within the optimal range for apple production. The organic matter content had risen from the depleted levels of 1989 to something approaching the soil biology that productive orchard ground requires. The drainage held. Through the wet spring of 1994, the wettest in Harlan County in a decade. The drainage system Walter had built in 1989 handled the water load without the pooling that had killed the original orchard. And in the fall of 1995, the 12 grafted trees produced fruit for the first time. Not a commercial quantity. A small quantity. The first-year production of trees still consolidating their energy into root development. But the fruit was extraordinary. Walter had known the Ruth Hensley tree was exceptional. He had eaten its apples in 1990 and had known. What he had not known, what could not be known until the grafted trees produced in their own environment, was what happened when that genetic heritage met the soil he had spent 6 years rebuilding. The fruit from the 12 trees in the fall of 1995 was better than anything that had come from the Ruth Hensley tree itself. Walter stood in his orchard in October of 1995 and held an apple from his own tree and understood something. The rootstock that had survived 10 years of wrong drainage and depleted soil had not survived randomly. It had survived because it was specifically adapted to this ground. When you grafted heritage variety scion wood onto rootstock that had already proven its relationship with specific ground, and then built the soil correctly so that relationship could fully express itself, you were not simply growing apples. You were growing the intersection of a specific variety and a specific piece of earth. There was no catalog for that. There was no nursery that sold it. It existed only here, on this 3 acres, on roots that had been trying since 1983 and had finally been given the soil they needed to show what they were. Walter ate the apple. He thought about 6 years. He thought about $300. He thought about unsalvageable. He went inside and told Margaret. Margaret ate the apple. She said, "We're going to need more trees." The expansion took 4 more years. Walter had anticipated this. He had been propagating rootstock from the surviving original roots since 1992, quietly, systematically, without announcement. By 1995, he had enough established rootstock to graft an additional 30 trees. He grafted them in the spring of 1996. He also made a decision that most people around him would not have made. He did not expand beyond the 3 acres. The property was the property. The soil he had built was specific to those 3 acres. The rootstock was specific to that ground. Adding acreage from elsewhere, even adjacent acreage, would mean starting the soil work over, and the soil work was the foundation of everything. Instead, he planted densely. 42 trees on 3 acres by 1997, managed for quality rather than volume, pruned to open canopy structures that maximized air circulation and light penetration, maintained with the same biological approach he had brought to the soil, no synthetic pesticides, no shortcuts. The expansion planting began producing in 1999. By 2000, 11 years after Walter had paid $300 for 3 acres of dead trees, the orchard was producing at a level that required Walter to have a conversation he had been planning for 2 years. He drove to the County Agricultural Extension Office in March of 2000. The current agent, not Dale Whitfield, who had retired in 1994, but a younger man named Gary Fulton, had heard of Walter's orchard in the way that everyone in the agricultural community of Harlan County had heard of it by then. Incrementally, through the years, as the story shifted from cautionary tale to something that nobody had quite found the right category for, Walter sat in Gary Fulton's office and laid out what he had. The production numbers. The fruit quality assessments. He had sent samples to the university lab in Lexington in 1998 and 1999 and had the results. The soil test history showing the recovery trajectory from 1989 to 2000. Gary Fulton read through the documentation. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "This is remarkable." "I need distribution," Walter said. "I'm producing more than the local market can absorb. I need to reach the 3-county area." Gary Fulton spent the next 40 minutes making phone calls. By the end of the day, Walter had appointments with 2 regional distributors and a specialty grocery buyer from Lexington who drove to Harlan County the following week, tasted the fruit, and offered Walter a contract on the spot. The contract was for more fruit than Walter could supply from 3 acres. He explained this. The buyer said, "Then supply what you can. We'll sell everything you bring us." By the summer of 2000, Walter Cobb's orchard was supplying the 3-county area. The fruit moved. Not because Walter had advertised it. Because fruit of that quality does not require advertising. It requires only that the right person taste it once. Dennis Prater tasted it at the Harlan County Farmers Market in August of 2000. He bought a bag. He ate one apple on the way to his truck. He went back and bought another bag. He found Walter at the market stall. He stood in front of him for a moment. "Walter," he said, "I owe you an apology. From 1989. From the feed store." Walter looked at him. "You don't owe me anything," Walter said. "I laughed," Dennis said. "I know," Walter said. "Most people did." "The apple," Dennis started. "Take another bag," Walter said. "Take it home to your family." Dennis took the bag. He stood there another moment. 11 years, he said. 11 years, Walter said. Dennis nodded. He drove home. He told his wife that evening that he had been wrong about something for 11 years and had only just found out how wrong. His wife asked what he had been wrong about. He showed her the apple. She tasted it. She said, "What took you so long to find this?" Dennis did not have a good answer for that. The orchard at its peak, the summers of 2001 through 2004, was producing quantities that Walter managed with the same systematic attention he had brought to everything since 1989. He had not rushed the expansion. He had not borrowed money. He had not brought in outside labor beyond what Margaret and their 2 children could contribute on weekends. He had not changed what had worked. The 42 trees on 3 acres produced what 3 acres of properly managed, biologically healthy orchard on specifically adapted rootstock with a heritage variety of exceptional quality could produce, which was more per acre than any conventionally managed orchard in the 3-county area. Gary Fulton brought a delegation from the State Agricultural Extension Service to see it in 2002. They walked the property for 2 hours. They asked questions about the drainage design, the soil amendment program, the grafting methodology, the rootstock selection. Walter answered every question with the same directness he brought to everything. They asked him where he had learned to do this. He said, "I figured it out." One of the delegates, a man from the university with credentials that filled 2 lines, looked at him. "You figured out an approach to orchard soil restoration that the Extension Service has not documented," the man said. "From scratch. On a property the Extension Service itself called unsalvageable." "I had good information from the soil tests," Walter said. "And I had time." "Most people would not have taken 11 years, the man said. Walter looked at the orchard. He thought about the 7 shoots in 1988. He thought about 6 of them surviving. He thought about one growing to 14 inches. He thought about Ruth Hensley's father planting a tree in 1912 and saying it would outlast anything you could buy from a nursery. "Most people wouldn't have started," Walter said. "That's the harder part. Once you start and you know you're right about what's underneath, the time is just time. You do the work each season and the seasons pass." The delegation wrote their report. It was published by the State Extension Service in 2003. It described the Cobb Orchard as a case study in biological soil restoration and heritage variety propagation on rootstock with demonstrated site adaptation. It did not use the word unsalvageable. Dale Whitfield, retired, living in town, still reading the extension publications out of habit, read the report. He sat with it for a while. He thought about 1987. About the property on Route 14. About the word he had written twice in that report. He thought about $300. He called Gary Fulton. "The Cobb Orchard report," he said. "Is it accurate?" Gary said it was. "I wrote the original assessment," Dale said. "In 1987. "I know," Gary said. A pause. "I used the word unsalvageable," Dale said. "Yes," Gary said. Another pause. "Was I wrong?" Dale said. Gary thought about it. "The soil was in the condition you described," Gary said. "Your assessment of the condition was accurate. Your conclusion about what could be done with it," he paused. "Walter Cobb showed us the conclusion was wrong." Dale was quiet for a long time. "Tell me what he did," Dale said. "All of it. In order." Gary told him. Dale listened without interrupting. When Gary finished, Dale said, "The drainage first." "He fixed the drainage before anything else." "Yes," Gary said. "That's what I missed," Dale said. "I saw the result of the drainage failure. I didn't ask what caused the drainage failure." He paused. If I'd asked that question, the rest of it would have followed. "Maybe," Gary said. "Not maybe," Dale said. "The question was there to be asked. I just didn't ask it." He paused. "Is there a way to thank him?" "Officially, through the service." Gary arranged it. Dale Whitfield drove to the Cobb orchard in the fall of 2003. He was 71 years old. He had retired 6 years earlier. He drove himself and carried a certificate from the State Extension Service acknowledging Walter's contribution to agricultural soil restoration practice. Walter came out to meet him. They shook hands. Dale gave him the certificate and said what he had driven out to say. "In 1987, I looked at this property and told the county it was unsalvageable. I was wrong. Not about the condition. The condition was what I described. But about what could be done with it. You saw something I didn't see, and you spent 11 years proving it. I wanted to tell you that personally." Walter looked at the certificate. He looked at Dale. "You did your job," Walter said. "With what you had. I had something different. I had been watching this property for a year before you came out. I had found the shoots. That changes what you see." Dale looked at the orchard. At 42 trees producing on rootstock that had survived what it had survived, and grafts from a tree an old man planted in 1912, and soil that a man had spent 6 years rebuilding one season at a time. "What do you call this variety?" Dale said. "The fruit. Has it been named?" "No," Walter said. "It should be named," Dale said. Walter had thought about this. "My wife says it should be called what it is," Walter said. "The intersection of a place and a patience." Dale looked at him. "That's a description," Dale said. "Not a name." "I know," Walter said. "I'm still working on the name." He never did name it formally. The fruit continued to be sold under the label Walter had designed in 1999. Simple, plain, no story on the front. Just the name of the farm. Just the year. Just the variety. People who bought it once came back for it. That was name enough. Walter Cobb farmed the orchard until 2011, 22 years after he paid $300 for 3 acres that everyone agreed was worthless. His son David took over the management that year. David had grown up watching every season of the orchard's life. He knew the drainage system the way you know something your father built with his hands over 2 years. He knew the soil, the tests, the trajectory, the way the cover crop program had been adjusted every 3 years based on what the tests showed. He knew the trees, each one, which root stock, which graft, what the fruit from each one tasted like in a good year and in a difficult one. He walked the orchard every morning before the day began. He pressed the soil between his fingers. He checked the drainage. He did what his father had taught him to do, which was not a technique or a program or a protocol. It was a way of paying attention, of asking what is actually here, of not deciding in advance what is possible, of beginning the work and letting the seasons tell you what the work was for. The orchard is still producing. The rootstock is now over 60 years old. The fruit is still extraordinary. $300. 11 years. 3 counties. The people who laughed were not wrong about what they saw. They were wrong about what could be done with it. Walter Cobb was not smarter than the Extension Service. He was more patient. And patience, applied to the right ground by the right person at the right depth, is the one input that cannot be purchased and cannot be rushed and cannot be replicated by any instrument or survey or report. It simply takes the time it takes. And then it produces. If this story stayed with you, if you've ever looked at something everyone else had given up on and felt that it wasn't finished yet, subscribe to the channel and join our growing family. Ring the bell. Share this with someone who knows that the most important harvests take the longest to grow. We'll see you at the next one.